I was halfway through stacking a fresh cord of firewood behind my lakeside cabin when the hum of tires on gravel shattered the quiet. Few ever came up this far. No tourists, no delivery trucks, and certainly no HOA suits. That's why I knew. The moment that white SUV crested the hill, something bad was about to unfold. Out stepped a woman in heels, far too fancy for pine needles. She was tall, angular, and carried a clipboard like it was a sword. Her navy blazer was crisp, despite the June heat, and a plastic badge on her chest read, Marlene Rutherford, HOA President, Carrington Shores. She didn't smile as she approached. Mr. Carter, I presume. I wiped the sweat from my brow. Depends who's asking. I represent the Carrington Shores Homeowners Association, she said, stepping over a patch of moss with visible disgust. We're here regarding the structure on this parcel. It appears to obstruct the newly approved lake access expansion. I raised an eyebrow. This structure is my home. She scanned her clipboard. The cabin is not listed as an approved residence within the development, and according to the Master Development Plan, this area is designated for communal lake access. I'm afraid we'll need it cleared by the end of the month. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. This cabin's been here since 1952. My grandfather built it with his own hands. I've got the deed, the tax receipts, everything. You're not clearing anything. Marlene's expression didn't flicker. If you're in possession of documentation, I suggest you submit it to the board. In the meantime, consider this your formal notice. She turned on her heel and strode back to her SUV, tires spitting gravel as she peeled out. No room for discussion, no curiosity, no decency. Just Bulldoze protocol with a lipstick smile. I stood there a long while, the wind rustling the evergreens, my hands clenched at my sides. The lake shimmered beyond the trees. My lake, my land. They didn't just want a path. They wanted to erase a legacy. That evening, I dug out the paperwork from a metal lockbox buried beneath the floorboards. My grandfather had been meticulous. Land deeds, county maps, tax filings, all signed, sealed, and valid. The parcel was private and had never been annexed into Carrington Shores. My family had sold land around the ridge to a developer in the yard. 90s, but the cabin and the slope down to the lake remained ours, somehow. They'd either ignored that fact or never bothered to check. The next day, I drove into town and dropped copies of my documents at the county recorder's office, just to make sure the records were current and accessible. I also made a stop at the sheriff's department. Deputy Horner, a fishing buddy from my younger days, greeted me with a skeptical glance when I explained. Marlene Rutherford, he asked, scratching his chin. She's gotten real aggressive with those HOA rules lately. Fined someone last month for hanging laundry on a non-approved clothesline. I gave a dry chuckle. Well, now she's trying to clear my cabin for a beach path. She picked the wrong man. Horner muttered. Still, part of me worried. HOAs weren't just about picket fences and flower beds. They had lawyers, money, influence. Enough to make life hell if they wanted. But I knew my rights. I knew my land. I returned to the cabin just as a drone buzzed overhead, floating like a metal vulture. It hovered for a few minutes, camera pointed at my dock, then zipped back toward the development below. The message was clear. They weren't done. That night, I sat on my porch with a bottle of rye and watched the lake glitter in the moonlight. My dog Jasper dozed at my feet, unaware of the storm brewing. The breeze carried the scent of pine and damp earth. This was the place I came to breathe, to remember my father and grandfather, to rebuild myself after a lifetime of litigation and courtroom noise. And now they wanted to erase it all, for a view. They didn't know it yet, but they'd made a mistake. I wasn't some hermit living off fish and solar panels. I'd spent 2 decades as a land use attorney in Austin. I knew how to fight this. On paper, in court, and if need be, in the dirt. They saw a cabin. I saw a war coming, and I had just taken my first step onto the battlefield. 3 days after Marlene's visit, a yellow stake appeared at the edge of my property. It wasn't there the day before. A bright plastic marker with a fluorescent pink ribbon tied around it, driven deep into the soil just 10 feet from my porch. Next to it, a laminated sign, zip-tied to a sapling, read, "Future Trail Access, Property of Carrington Shores, HOA." I yanked the stake out and snapped it in half. By noon, 2 more appeared, one near my dock and another by the tree line. That night, I installed a motion-activated camera on the cabin's eave and started keeping my 3006 within arm's reach. The message was clear. Intimidation disguised as progress. I wasn't new to this kind of maneuver. As an attorney, I'd seen this brand of passive aggression time and again, stealth development, deliberate errors in boundary lines, slow legal suffocation. But the difference here, I wasn't someone else's client. This time, it was personal. On Friday, I received a certified envelope stamped with the HOA's seal. Inside was a formal notice of non-compliance. The language was thick with legalese, citing a supposed violation of Carrington Shores' community guidelines for unauthorized use of protected easement zones. I stared at it for a long moment, the corner of the page curling in my fingers. There was no easement, not on my land, but the strategy was obvious. Flood me with paperwork, try to wear me down, and hope I'd fold to avoid the headache. They didn't understand who they were dealing with. The next morning, I attended the HOA board, meeting in person. It was held in a 2-bright community centre at the bottom of the hill, surrounded by perfectly manicured hedges and beige siding as far as the eye could see. The room smelled of burnt coffee and disinfectant. "Name?" asked the receptionist. At the sign-in desk, "Eli Carter. I'm not a resident, but I've been served notice by this board." She hesitated, flipping through a printed agenda. "You're not on the list." I nodded toward the door. "I'll wait inside." The board sat in a semicircle, flanked by folding chairs filled with bored residents clutching printed handouts. Marlene sat at the center, lips pursed like she was sucking on a lemon. Her eyes flicked to me as I walked in, but didn't linger when the time came for community concerns. I stood. "I received a notice about my cabin," I said, holding up the envelope, claiming I'm violating an easement that doesn't exist. Marlene gave a thin smile. "Mr. Carter, thank you for joining us. As you're technically outside the HOA boundary, you don't have standing to address the board. I'd argue otherwise, since your expansion crosses into land I legally own." Polite murmurs rippled through the room. Marlene's smile didn't fade. "As you're aware, our long-term development plans include increased lake access for Carrington Shores. Residents, the master community plan designates shared waterfront spaces. That plan ends where your property ends." I interrupted, and I brought a survey to prove it. I unfolded a county-certified map onto the nearest table. Bold red lines outlined the ridge, the dock, and most importantly, the creeping boundary where a dozen homes had been built too close to, or even slightly across, my land. I'm not just here to argue about a cabin. I'm here to tell you that 12 of your homes are encroaching on private property. Now the room stirred louder. Some residents turned to one another. Marlene's eyes narrowed, her smile faltering for the first time. "You can't expect us to believe. I can expect you to read." I held up notarized copies of the land deeds. "This isn't a negotiation. I'm giving you notice. Cease all activity related to your so-called trail access. If I find another stake in my soil, I file lawsuits, plural, for trespassing, property damage, and illegal land seizure. A silence settled like dust. Marlene leaned forward. Mr. Carter, if this is some form of extortion, you bulldozed into the wrong backyard. I turned and walked out, leaving my documentation on the table. Let them sweat over it. Back at the cabin, Jasper barked at a squirrel and chased it across the dock. The sun dipped low behind the trees, casting golden light over the still water. The quiet should have been peaceful, but the air now held tension. I knew what would come next. They wouldn't back off, not easily, but I was no longer waiting. I was drawing my line in the dirt and daring them to cross it. 2 days after the HOA meeting, the first retaliatory move arrived. Not with a bang, but a fine. A stiff envelope taped to my mailbox. Unsigned, no postage. Demanded payment of $14,250 in retroactive easement maintenance fees. Attached was a grainy map with a bright orange line drawn right through my property, labeled Proposed Trail Corridor, HOA Jurisdiction. At the bottom was a threat of lien if payment wasn't made within 15 days. I laughed out loud. This wasn't about fees. It was a shot across the bow, an attempt to scare me into compliance. But what they didn't realize was that every letter they sent, every bogus claim they filed, added fuel to a fire they weren't equipped to put out. They wanted war. I gave them law. I spent the next 48 hours drafting a multi-count civil complaint, trespassing, attempted encroachment, fraudulent claims of ownership. I cited relevant statutes, included annotated maps, and attached notarized copies of all relevant deeds and surveys. I even documented the drone flights. They violated FAA regulations when flown over private property without consent. Then, I filed it in district court and requested an emergency injunction. And just for fun, I had copies delivered not just to Marlene, but to every single board member of the HOA and their private development firm. The silence after that was glorious, until the bulldozer came. It arrived at sunrise. I was sipping my first cup of coffee on the porch when I heard the low mechanical growl. Down the hill, right at the property line, a large yellow cat excavator rolled into view. A work crew in neon vests followed behind, setting up cones and hammering in new stakes. I walked down with Jasper, trotting beside me, heart pounding, not with fear, but righteous fury. The foreman barely looked up. Just following orders, sir. We were told to begin clearing this area for the lake trail. Got permits filed with the county. Did you check whose land you're clearing? I asked. He pointed at a clipboard. Carrington Shores HOA. I held up my phone and snapped a photo. This is private property, and unless you want to be listed as a named party in a criminal trespass suit, I suggest you shut this down, now. He looked skeptical, until I held out a laminated copy of the injunction, hot off the court clerk's desk. His face changed. Give me 5 minutes. He called someone, his boss, presumably. Then another call. Voices grew tense. Finally, he walked over, rubbing the back of his neck. We're pulling out. Didn't know the HOA was fighting a legal battle over the parcel. The crew packed up and left. No apologies. Just stiff silence and the sound of Diesel groaning back down the hill. But I didn't relax. Because that was the moment I realized Marlene wasn't just posturing anymore. She was desperate. She'd bet the HOA's prestige, its budget, and maybe even her reputation on pushing this trail through. And now, with every legal victory I scored, she was cornered. Cornered people make reckless choices. Sure enough, the next day, I returned from town to find my dock sawed clean in half. No note, no witness. Just a clean professional cut down the center. Like someone had used a chainsaw and disappeared before I returned. Jasper growled as we stepped over the splintered boards. They didn't want to win in court anymore. They wanted to punish me. I called the sheriff. Deputy Horner came out, took photos, filed a vandalism report. No prints, he said. But this wasn't just kids. It was targeted. I nodded. I think we're past the point of civility. I can station a patrol car near the ridge for a few nights, he offered. But if they want to push you off this land, they're gonna keep escalating. I'm counting on it, because they still hadn't figured out the worst part. Not only did I own the ridge and the dock and the slope down to the lake, I owned the very land half their development sat on. It was hidden in the chain of title, buried under decades of subdivided parcels and sloppy filings. My grandfather had leased the land to developers in '98 on a conditional renewable agreement, no sale, no transfer. The lease was still active, and the next review was set for this year, pending my signature. Without that, every single house built on that hillside was standing on borrowed dirt. They bulldozed my dock. I was about to bulldoze their illusion of ownership, and the wrecking ball was already swinging. Marlene called me the day after I sent the notice. Not a letter, not an email, a direct call. She must have dug through records to find my number. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won out. "Mr. Carter," she began, voice clipped tightly. "Wound. We need to talk." I thought that's what court was for. I replied evenly. A long pause. "Not everything has to be a courtroom battle," she said. "Let's be reasonable." I stepped onto my porch, overlooking the shattered remains of my dock. Jasper sat beside me, ears perked, as if sensing a change in the air. "You sent a bulldozer. Someone cut my dock in half. Reason left the station weeks ago. That was a contractor mistake." She deflected. "And No, don't insult me." I cut in. "You're not calling to apologize. You're calling because I sent a notice of non-renewal to your development office." Silence. I continued. "Your HOA sits on land leased by my family. That lease expires next month, unless I sign an extension, and I won't. Not after everything you pulled." She exhaled sharply, finally dropping the pretense. "Do you realize the chaos that will cause? These families should know who's really in charge of the ground under their feet." I said, "You can't evict a neighborhood." "I don't have to. I just have to not renew. That makes every property's legal standing precarious. Title insurance won't cover it. Lenders get antsy. Property values nosedive. And when the HOA folds under the pressure, well, you can explain that at your next board meeting. You'd destroy hundreds of lives over what? Spite? No, over respect. Something your board forgot the moment you tried to erase my cabin." Another pause. Then, "What do you want?" The question dropped like a stone. I leaned against the rail, watching the sun crawl across the lake. First, full restoration of my dock, paid for by the HOA. Second, a public apology, signed by the board and delivered in writing to every resident. Third, you withdraw your fake trail project and agree in perpetuity to never touch 1 square inch of my land. That's steep. Your board bulldozed first. She didn't respond. "I'll give you 72 hours, I said. "After that, the non-renewal stands, and I'll begin contacting homeowners myself." I ended the call. Marlene folded. 3 days later, a glossy printed letter appeared in every Carrington Shores mailbox. It bore the HOA's seal, typed in somber font. "We regret our actions in pursuing unauthorized development on neighboring private property. We extend our apologies to Mr. Eli Carter for the intrusion and disruption caused by our oversight. It was as much humility as I'd ever wring from them. The dock was rebuilt within a week, better than before. They even installed new lighting and railings. A quiet crew came and removed every stake, sign, and marker near my land. They didn't say a word, just packed up and vanished by sundown. But the real victory came quietly. In the weeks that followed, word spread. Homeowners began emailing me directly, concerned, curious. Some were angry at the board. Others wanted to know how this had all gone unnoticed. I told them the truth, that their neighborhood existed only by the good grace of a man they tried to push out. I didn't renew the lease. Instead, I negotiated individual land use agreements with the residents themselves. No HOA interference. No middleman. If they wanted to keep living there, they dealt with me. Marlene resigned shortly after. Her final message to the board was leaked. An icy 2-sentence note that blamed external legal pressures and untenable public scrutiny. Carrington Shores still stands, but it answers to new rules now. Mine. I didn't do it for the power. I did it because sometimes people forget where they came from. They build gates and write rules and pretend that land can be ruled by paper and arrogance. But land remembers, and when you try to pave over its history, it has a way of fighting back. Through the hands of those who never left it, I stood on my dock one evening, Jasper resting at my feet, the water calm as glass. Across the lake, porch lights blinked on, one by one. No bulldozers, no signs, just peace. I didn't win with noise. I won with roots, and I'd be damned if anyone ever forgot it again.